Hi, it's Professor Fiegel, and we are back to start a new book. This one is for my summer session at Queens College. It is going to begin with this fabulous book, Portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. You students at home are probably going to be using the electronic version that I posted online. There's also several other. This is a really great edition because it has so much commentary and criticism of the book. It's in so much detail and information into Wilde's biography. And, this was the only novel he ever wrote. And it's kind of like very indicative of his personality in a sense. As a playwright, he was definitely able to show sides of himself and his thinking. But in this book, we have an omniscient narrator, and you know that omniscient narrator is kind of like this all-knowing narrator whose point of view we have, and he can see into the mind and feelings of all of the characters, which is very fitting because a lot of the tenets around what this book is about is the idea of sin, the idea of eternity, the idea of art, right? Like when I'm teaching poetry, I tell you guys like a 16-line poem can have 20 themes about it. It could be about life and about death and about loss and about love and fidelity and all these things. And this book, the reason why I teach it is because it really has a lot of the similar themes, and I think it also speaks to something that's really never not relevant, which is the choices that we make in life and why we make these choices. And so let's just dive in. In my intro to the course and to the book, you're going to see that in our lecture time together, I'm going to introduce to you a little bit about Oscar Wilde, a little bit about the book. When we're reading academically, we're not reading for entertainment, right? It's not like we're just at the movie theater and we're popping popcorn and we have no engagement whatsoever except just observers, right? Spectators. When you're reading for literature, to understand it, to appreciate it, it's a much closer reading. It's a much deeper reading, and it doesn't hurt to know the ending right away. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to tell you the ending, of course, because I still want you guys to be in suspense. This is a thriller, by the way. And it is Gothic in the sense that it mixes horror and romance, and that's a very specific genre of art, right? Gothic art. So let's get into it. The whole book is essentially the story of Dorian Gray, who is our main character, our protagonist. And we're introduced to him, and I'm just going to give like a brief synopsis, all right? And then I'll point back to these things later as I go through the text. We're introduced to him kind of like a blank slate. And I think that it's really great that Oscar Wilde does that because, as you'll see as we go through the book, you can kind of see yourself as a Dorian Gray. You can kind of see yourself as someone who really has no backbone, someone who really doesn't know what he or she believes yet, right? Saying you believe something is one thing. Being able to answer why you believe that is a whole other thing. And if you don't know why you believe something, then you really don't believe it, right? Because that's the whole essence of belief. You might know something, but you may not believe it, right? And so this really is questioning the idea of morality, the question of sin, goodness versus evil, if there's such a thing as eternity, if there's such a thing as heaven or hell. We have a very supernatural force in the book, which is very indicative of Gothic literature as well, because, with the horror and the romance comes this idea of supernatural. So like other Gothic literature books, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, that's a poem, Dracula, Frankenstein, those are all Gothic examples. So we're introduced to this main character, Dorian Gray, and like I said, he kind of doesn't know what he believes in yet, so he's very, very vulnerable to influence, and I think we all are, right? We can be persuaded very easily to do certain things or to believe certain things, and Dorian Gray gets a lot of influence around him, and so that's another theme of like, what is influencing you? What has influenced you to be the person that you are and to make the choices that you make, right? Essentially, our life really just comes down not so much as what we think about things, but what we do about them. And I always tell my students that probably by the end of your life, you could count the amount of choices that really change the direction of your life on one hand, like big decisions, like, do I get married? Do I marry this person? Do I have this baby? Do I divorce this person? Do I get that job that requires me to move? You know, and those really can change or pivot the course of our lives. And so Dorian Gray makes a very interesting choice, and it happens in the very, very beginning of the book. In fact, it's going to happen in this lecture. And the whole rest of the story is the consequences of this choice that he makes. And I think that we understand that, like I said, there's choices that really change the direction of our lives. And I'm sure you could probably think of choices that you've made that if not for that choice, you would not be where you are today, whether it's good or bad or indifferent, right? Sometimes the choice is to make no choice, to make no move, right? And that's a choice. So let's begin in chapter 1. We're introduced to the main characters, and you guys already read this, so I'm going to just be kind of hitting the high notes of what I would want you to pull out from the text. So, very, very, very important in understanding the way that this book is written is this idea of aestheticism, and then secondarily and separately, this idea of hedonism. So aestheticism is things being pretty just for pretty's sake. You know, like a woman standing and just being admired simply for her beauty or her stature. Or a flower being valuable just because it's pretty to look at. And so aesthetics really take to this idea of being surrounded by things, and that's not aesthetic, that's different. Take to this idea of being surrounded by luxury, being surrounded by luxurious fabrics and beautiful things to look at just because it's beautiful. And just like in the first class when I go over this preface, and Oscar Wilde is known, if you ever just Googled Oscar Wilde quotes, you would find some amazing quotes. I mean, he was really known for his wit and his humor and his cutting sense of insight. And he does a defense of this book. And the reason why he does a defense of this book is because when it was published, it was Victorian England at the time. And the typical literature of that time was a novel of manners, or just kind of like, you know, just how we live in England, you know, how we're all perfect and pious, and we don't show our emotions, and we say the right things, and if we're hurt, we keep it to ourselves, and just kind of teaching people how to live, essentially, right? I mean, a lot of where our literature comes from is a teaching tool, right? So a novel of manners was essentially just kind of telling people how we live. And so we have those awesome movies and books that reflect that. This was published in that time, and yet it is a completely different story that's being told. In fact, if we were to look at it as a novel of manners to kind of exhibit how we should live, and that's kind of what Oscar Wilde wants us to do here, it would be at the opposite end of the spectrum of where the etiquette is, and what is appropriate and what is good conduct. Dorian Gray's etiquette and behavior start out really admirable as we meet him, and then again, you can, like I'm saying, like the choices of the consequences of his choice really show what he's doing. So there is definitely themes of homosexuality in this text that were not appropriate at the time it was published. There's definite themes of hedonism, which is a philosophy where we just do whatever we want, but not necessarily to learn from it, just because it's fun. So like drink as much as you want, and do as many drugs as you want, and sleep with whoever you want, and like, you know, eat as much as you want, and eat all the fatty foods that you want, not because you're going to learn anything from the experience, but just because it's fun and we can, so why not, right? Like excess is the best. That's what kind of hedonism. So as you can tell, those two, just those themes, those underlying currents, right? Homosexuality, hedonism, and just this idea of sin not being real, but then we kind of come to the end of where like, is it? So, okay, chapter 1, we are introduced to the book by the setting. And Oscar Wilde's writing is very rich in this book. He's very luxurious with details. Again, it's kind of following the philosophy here. He begins with the studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred among the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. So anytime you're a writer, and this is just a craft tool, right? Senses. We use our 5 senses to understand the world around us. And so when we're reading, especially because it's like a two-dimensional page, right? We're just reading black and white on a page. The writer is going to really try to give you a sense of where you are to be in this experience of the book. And here he's activating all the senses. First, we have a studio, so we have a very specific location. It's filled with the rich odor of roses, so already our nose is tingling, right? The light summer wind stirred. Okay, so the light summer wind, so I can feel the wind now, amid the trees of the garden. Okay, so now I hear the trees stirring amongst the wind. And there's the open door, and then lilac comes in, and then another perfume of the pink flowering thorn. So he's really activating our senses right there, okay? From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags on which he was lying, smoking, as was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-colored blossoms of a laburnum. All right, so for you guys adding to your dictionary, you know that there's two words in here you probably have not heard of yet. Divan, right, D-I-V-A-N, and laburnum, which is a kind of tree. So those are to be added to the dictionary for the course. Whose tremulous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame-like as theirs. And now and then, this is all just one sentence, mind you, and now and then the fantastic shadows of birds in flight flitted across the long two-sore silk curtains that were stretched in front of the huge window, producing a kind of momentary Japanese effect, still the same sentence, and making him think of those pallid jade-faced painters of Tokyo who, through the medium of an art that is necessarily immobile, seek to convey the sense of swiftness and motion. That was all one sentence. That one sentence went from the beginning of this paragraph all the way down to there. Okay? So this is the kind of writing that Oscar Wilde is introducing you to for this book, because this is exactly what the whole book is like. It is a very rich surrender to your senses, okay? And that is also a theme that's in the book, senses and the soul. Which do we believe in more? Do we believe in the soul that we don't see or know or understand or can quantify at all? Or do we believe in our senses, like what we see? Like we've heard many times people say, yep, I'll believe it when I see it, right? Well, we live most of our life like that, right? That's called deductive reasoning. And so that's another theme that is going to be touched on very directly, actually, by this author. So let's move. The next page, because I'm going, but, in my book, but in the next paragraph, in the center of the room, okay, now there's in the center of this space of beauty, okay? And we already have one character, Lord Henry Wotton. He's character number one that's been introduced to us. In the center of the room, clamped to an upright easel, stood a full-length portrait of a young man of extraordinary personal beauty. And in front of it, some little distance away, was sitting the artist himself, Basil Hallward. We just have our three main characters introduced to us in that third paragraph opening. Because the young man that is in the portrait is Dorian Gray. And what I love about the way Wilde introduces Gray, just to kind of keep that suspense, is in the entire first chapter, he's not there, but he's there. And what I mean by that is we don't physically have Dorian Gray present in the studio in chapter 1. But when he enters the studio in chapter 2, there's been such a fuss made about him in chapter 1 that he's already the center of the story before he's even been introduced to Lord Henry Wotton, or even before, like if this was a film, right? It would be the whole opening scene. We're talking about Dorian. So by the time he walks in, we're like, oh, it's like a hype has been built up around him, right? And so let's jump to the next. There's a ton of witticisms that Oscar Wilde is writing in this story through the character of Lord Henry Wotton. And I think that that's probably, if Wilde was to be anybody, he would be that character, the bad influence on Dorian. And he's also the narrator's voice. I just so hear Wilde as the narrator. And there is a point in this book where the narrator pierces the fourth wall and he says I, which is crazy, right? Because an omniscient narrator, and in this sense, when we're talking about sin and infinity and eternity and souls, and that would likely be God, or like some kind of God type persona. So it'd be interesting to wonder if Wilde sees himself or saw himself in that way. So a bunch of different witticisms. I would like to point out a few, but I'm not going to point out all of them. They talk about beauty. what is real beauty, right? So Lord Henry and Basil go back and forth. Now Basil's an artist. Lord Henry is just like a lord, okay, really rich guy. And he's looking at this painting of Dorian Gray, and he's like, wow, that's a good looking man, you know? And I'm not attracted to men, but that is like a good looking man. And Basil is very insecure about the painting. And he says that there's too much of me in it, in that painting. And Lord Henry laughs, and he's like, really? Because the guy looks nothing like you, Basil, right? So he says, too much of yourself in it. Upon my word, Basil, I didn't know you were so vain, and I really can't see any resemblance between you with your rugged, strong face and your coal black hair, and this young Adonis, who looks as if he was made of ivory and rose leaves. Why, my dear Basil, he is a Narcissus. You know, like the story of Narcissus, right? He was so enamored with the way he looked, he would just look in the water at himself until he fell in. And he said, but beauty, real beauty, ends where an intellectual expression begins. Intellect is in itself a mode of exaggeration and destroys the harmony of any face. So a lot of talk about what is more valuable in society, beauty or intelligence, right? If we could have both, we'd love both, right? But if you can't, then he's basically saying, hey, beauty is better. Why? Because it takes no effort to be beautiful, is basically his argument. And then he looks at the painting of Dorian Gray and he says, he is some brainless, beautiful creature. So the hype around Dorian Gray is just so big that he is just this, anonymous, is that the way to say that word? This like bigger than life character. And in fact, you know, I teach this book all the time for this course, this intro literature course, because number one, it's not too long of a novel. And I don't think people read enough novels nowadays. So I choose this over teaching short stories, but at the beginning. But because it is one of those books where the character becomes so real that it's like that wonderful magic of fiction where you know the character isn't real, but yet you recall him or her as if they were, right? And that's just what art is about, because you're living more lives than just your own by engaging with these characters. So we start to get a couple of character reveals in the text. Character reveal is when a character, either himself or herself, or from another person who knows the character, reveals something that is important to know about this character. And why it's important to know these things about characters? Well, because characters make choices in the book, and especially because it's a suspense kind of thriller book. When someone goes disappearing, it's good to know that this person doesn't generally disappear, right? So here's a character reveal that Basil makes about himself, and he says, oh, I can't explain. When I like people immensely, I never tell their names to anyone. It is like surrendering a part of them. I have grown to love secrecy. It seems to be the one thing that can make modern life mysterious or marvelous to us. The commonest thing is delightful if one only hides it. When I leave town now, I never tell my people where I am going. If I did, I would lose all my pleasure. It is a silly habit, I dare say, but somehow it seems to bring a great deal of romance into one's life. So Basil says that, right? And now, Lord Henry kind of in the next paragraph gives a character reveal about himself, and Basil says, you probably think I'm foolish, and he says, no, not at all, not at all. You seem to forget that I'm married, and the one charm of marriage is that it makes a life of deception absolutely necessary for both parties. I never know where my wife is, and my wife never knows what I'm doing. When we meet, we do meet occasionally when we dine out together or go down to the Duke's. We tell each other the most absurd stories with the most serious faces. My wife is very good at it, much better, in fact, than I am. She never gets confused over her dates, and I always do. But when she does find me out, she makes no row at all. Now, row is an English term for an argument. I sometimes wish she would, but she merely laughs at me. So, again, we kind of see the frivolity that Lord Henry talks about his marriage and his wife with. So you think, oh, well, this guy doesn't really care about his marriage, right? He doesn't really care about how things appear. But it's actually quite the opposite. And then Basil reveals something about him. Okay, so we have two examples of character reveal. One where the character says, oh, this is how I am. And then another way where the character says, oh, this is how you are. Okay, so two types of reveal. One is like internal and one is external. Let's say it like that. Basil says, you are an extraordinary fellow. You never say a moral thing, and you never do a wrong thing. Your cynicism is simply a pose. So he's basically calling out Lord Henry, who's also goes by the term Harry in the book as kind of like his nickname. And this is super important to understand, because when Lord Henry is going to influence Dorian Gray, he is coming, we think he's like kind of like this bad dude who must do bad things because he wants other people to do bad things. He's not like that at all. Don't forget what Basil says here. Your cynicism is simply a pose. So actually, if he says that he takes his marriage quite lightly, then we're really to believe that he doesn't take it lightly at all. Okay? So we have one character, Basil, who is very sincere, very vulnerable, a sweet guy, the artist. He's doting on this man who he's basically fallen in love with, and Basil is in love with Dorian Gray. Okay. But then we have Henry, or Harry, and he is kind of like this guy who says really blunt things, and he has a lot of, he's of a high stature in society, so it's bold for him to say these wild things, like I said, novel of manners type of thing, right? But he's also the guy who is never going to risk anything. So I'm sorry to ruin the book for you, but that's very true. It's important for you to know that going in and understanding the book. So, okay. So, Basil says this about the painting, because remember we said, oh, I'm too much in it. And he's like, you're not in it at all. This guy's gorgeous. He's not like you at all. Basil says he's not going to exhibit the painting, and Lord Henry's like, why would you not want to put this in a gallery? Like, this is one of your best works, if not your best work ever. And he says, the reason I will not exhibit this picture is that I am afraid that I've shown in it the secret of my own soul. Wow. Okay. And then Basil tells the story of meeting Dorian Gray. And when he recounts the story, you can see it's very much a romantic story. It's like love at first sight. He says, I went down to a crush at Lady Brandon's. A crush was a term for a party, like a get-together. And he said, I turned halfway around and saw Dorian Gray for the first time. When our eyes met, I felt that I was growing pale. A curious sensation of terror came over me. I knew that I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating that if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. I did not want any external influence in my life. You know yourself, Harry, how independent I am by nature. I've always been my own master. Had at least always been so till I met Dorian Gray. That is huge. Hello, he's your master? Like, you just met this guy and all of a sudden you're just like, take my life. So he's obviously very struck by Dorian's appearance, so much so that he reads into these things, right? Like, oh, I'm surrendering my soul, my art, everything. Then, of course, Harry says something that just terrorizes Basil. He says, oh, I want to meet him. And Basil's like, oh my God, please, no, you can't meet him. Now, Basil is obviously like, has latent homosexual tendencies. At the time, it wasn't like the thing to be out. But it's very clear that he's very much in love with Dorian Gray, okay? Harry, so you think maybe he thinks that, oh, Harry's going to fall in love with Dorian too, and then I'm going to lose Dorian. That's kind of what he's afraid of, but not in a romantic sense, not in the sense of like, oh, that's my crush and I don't want you hanging out with my crush. What he is trying to avoid is Harry's influence on Dorian, because right now the way that he sees Dorian is perfect, okay? And he's afraid that Dorian might change. And if he's in love with Dorian as this perfect thing, then what's going to happen to Basil if Dorian changes? I mean, if love is really this infinite soulmate thing, right? If it's really meant for just one and one, that's perfect for you. So he's really very worried. Hold on, I'm just jumping down to all this stuff. I like persons better than people. Tell me more about Dorian Gray. How often do you see him? Right? This is Harry asking Basil, and Basil says, every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He is absolutely necessary to me. How extraordinary. I thought you would never care for anything but your art. And Basil says, he is all my art to me now. Okay, so now we're starting to see these two things, right? So Basil is vulnerable, sweet guy. He's just falling in love. Lord Henry's kind of cynical, very blunt, almost a little rude sometimes the way he speaks. But we see that Basil's very serious. Like when Basil speaks, he really means what he says. And then we're going to see Lord Henry's quite the opposite. Whatever he says, he doesn't mean. Okay? Again, really important to know. They talk about Dorian Gray being barely over 20. They just talk again about how beautiful the portrait is. And again, like when I said, Basil is, Dorian Gray rather, he's not in the room with them, but he's really in the room, right? So we're starting to see how much in the room he really is. He's afraid that people will see that he's in love with Dorian if he exhibits the painting. He's afraid for people to know that he's in love with him. So that's why he doesn't want to exhibit the portrait. And because he's such a serious guy, he really takes this seriously. He's like, no. Like, it's going to be obvious that, like, I'm in love with this guy if I show this thing. And Henry says, an artist should create beautiful things, but should put nothing of his own life into them. We live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography. We have lost the abstract sense of beauty. And now, again, he's referring to aestheticism, which is what I was referring to in the beginning of my lecture. Okay, this idea of beauty being better. And then on the next page, in fact, he goes on, and Harry loves to talk a lot of crazy things. So he says, genius lasts longer than beauty. In the wild struggle for existence, we want to have something that endures, and so we fill our minds with rubbish and facts. But then he goes down, and he's talking about, he's basically saying that we think that knowledge is so valuable to us because our beauty fades. And so we can't be beautiful forever, but we can be smart forever. So that's why society thinks, oh, intelligence is more valuable than beauty because beauty is fleeting, right? But then... that he kind of makes this prediction for Basil and saying, your affinity for this guy is going to just disappear, you know? But then he says, what you have told me is quite a romance of art, one might call it. And the worst of having a romance of any kind is that it leaves one so unromantic, right? It's a typical witticism from Oscar Wilde, like typical thing Wilde would say. Harry, don't talk like that, Basil immediately says. As long as I live, the personality of Dorian Gray will dominate me. You can't feel what I feel. You change too often. Again, pointing to his seriousness and Harry's lack of seriousness. And in fact, there's so many times where Wilde writes, not Harry said or Harry speaks, but Harry laughs. Harry's laughing throughout this whole book. Like, imagine a person who everything he says is funny to him. Because he's joking the whole time. He's not serious. So in this whole conversation, Basil is trying to be like, no, you don't get it. Like, he's dominated me. Harry's like, okay, yeah, you're insane. Right? This is the kind of relationship, and these are who these characters are. So that when Dorian Gray comes in the middle, imagine, Basil over here, Lord Henry over here, and Dorian Gray's right here. Dorian's like, oh, you're the good angel. You're the bad angel. You're the one who's super serious. You're the one who makes me laugh. You're the one who makes me think. And now I get to be whoever I want to be, right? I have this very fair and balanced influence from both of you, and I'm going to choose who I'm going to be. And that word dominate, right? Like when we're talking diction or word choice for authors use, there's so many words that authors have access to and can use in appropriate situations. The word dominate, it's not just like Dorian Gray will have control over me. Dorian Gray will affect me. Dorian Gray will influence me. Dorian Gray will always be on my mind. I'll never forget him. It's like he's going to dominate me. And when you think of domination, you think of mind, body, and soul, right? Like I can't move. I'm dominated. I'm like a robot now, right? Domination is a real serious word to dominate someone. Just look that up in the dictionary, and I bet it'll be even more shocking than you think it is initially. At the very bottom of my page 15, at the very end of the chapter, "You must introduce me now," cried Lord Henry, laughing. Okay, so he's like, Basil's just been like, "No, you don't get it. Like, he's my life." Lord Henry's like, "Come on, let me meet the guy." And now, then in the very last two paragraphs, we have the perfect exemplification of what I've just been talking about between the difference of Basil and Lord Henry. He looked at Lord Henry and said, and you can imagine Basil's now being very serious. He says, "Dorian Gray is my dearest friend. He has a simple and beautiful nature. Your aunt was quite right in what she said of him. Don't spoil him. Don't try to influence him. Your influence would be bad. The world is wide and has many marvelous people in it. Don't take away from me the one person who gives to my art whatever charm it possesses. My life as an artist depends on him. Mind, Harry, I trust you." You know what Harry says in return? "What nonsense you talk," said Lord Henry, smiling, and takes Basil by the arm and leads him into the house, because the studio is separate, like it's in the garden. It's an art studio. So that's chapter 1. And I'm going to continue to do lectures for every chapter, but this is already running 30 minutes long, so I'm going to cut it here. But I give you as good of an introduction as I can right now, and then we're going to talk about it more in our discussions in our synchronous sessions on Google Classroom.